The rain hammered against the windows of Molly's tavern like an insistent messenger refusing to be ignored. Steam rose from wet coats hanging near the door, and the warm amber glow of Edison bulbs cast dancing shadows across weathered wooden tables. It was the kind of evening that drove people indoors, seeking refuge not just from the storm outside, but from the storms within their own minds. In the far corner, beneath a vintage photograph of dock workers from 1923, sat two figures who seemed to exist in different centuries, despite sharing the same moment. The older man, distinguished with silver hair and wearing a navy wool sweater, nursed a glass of red wine with the deliberate precision of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring his words. Across from him, a woman in her 30s with intense dark eyes and calloused hands, wrapped around a simple cup of black coffee, her worn leather jacket telling stories of late nights spent writing by lamplight. They had been introduced an hour earlier by Professor Martinez, a mutual colleague who had insisted they would find each other fascinating. "Seneca," he had said to the woman, "meet Simone. She's been exploring the intersection of justice and spirituality in modern society." Then, turning to the man, "Simone, this is Seneca. He's been working on how ancient wisdom applies to contemporary ethical dilemmas." What Professor Martinez hadn't anticipated was how quickly their conversation would evolve from polite academic exchange to something far more penetrating. "You know," Simone said, her French accent softening the edges of her English as she leaned forward, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about justice requiring emotional distance." She paused, watching the steam rise from her coffee. "But how can we truly understand justice if we refuse to feel the weight of suffering it's meant to address?" Seneca set down his wineglass with deliberate care, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, but that's precisely the problem. The moment we allow emotion to cloud our judgment, we risk making decisions based on impulse rather than principle. Justice isn't about feeling good about our choices. It's about making the right ones." The tavern hummed with quiet conversations and the occasional clink of glasses, but their corner had become an island of intensity. Other patrons seemed to sense something significant unfolding, unconsciously lowering their voices, as if not to disturb whatever was building between these two strangers. Right according to whom? Simone's voice carried a note of challenge that wasn't quite confrontational but demanded an answer. "Your rational principles? The logic of men who have never gone hungry, never felt the desperation of watching their children suffer while institutions debate the proper procedures for help." Seneca's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a recognition that he was facing not just an intellectual opponent, but someone who had walked through territories of human experience he could only theorize about. "You speak as if reason and compassion are enemies," he replied, his voice maintaining its measured tone. "But consider this. Without rational frameworks, compassion becomes arbitrary. We feel for the victims we can see, the stories that move us, while ignoring systemic injustices that affect thousands. Emotion is powerful, but it's also selective and often unfair." Simone's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in the way of someone focusing on a particularly complex mathematical equation. "And what happens when your rational frameworks become so removed from human reality that they justify the very suffering they claim to address? When justice becomes an abstract concept, administered by people who have forgotten what it feels like to be truly vulnerable?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Around them, the tavern continued its evening rhythm, the bartender polishing glasses, a couple sharing a quiet laugh, the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. But in their corner, time seemed to slow as two fundamentally different approaches to one of humanity's oldest questions began to circle each other like cautious fighters. Seneca picked up his wine again, swirling it gently as he considered his response. This wasn't going to be the kind of polite academic discussion he had expected. This woman, this Simone, was pushing him toward territory where his carefully constructed philosophical frameworks would be tested against something far more immediate and unsettling. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Molly's tavern, a different kind of tempest was just beginning to build. Seneca's fingers traced the rim of his wineglass as he searched for the right words to bridge the gap he sensed opening between them. The amber liquid caught the light, casting tiny golden reflections on the scarred wooden table that had witnessed countless conversations, arguments, and revelations. "Let me tell you something about justice," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent studying human nature. "I once knew a judge, a good man, deeply compassionate, who consistently gave lighter sentences to attractive defendants. He didn't realize he was doing it. His heart was in the right place, but his emotions were making his decisions for him. Simone's coffee had grown cold, forgotten as she listened. The intensity in her dark eyes suggested she was hearing not just his words, but the deeper currents beneath them. Meanwhile, Seneca continued, the plain-looking defendants, often from poorer backgrounds, received harsher punishment for identical crimes. His compassion, unguided by rational principle, became a source of injustice. This is why I argue that true justice must be grounded in reason, not because I lack feeling, but because feelings left unchecked corrupt the very thing they claim to serve. A server approached their table, offering refills, but both declined with barely a glance. The outside world had receded. There was only this conversation, this moment of two minds grappling with questions that had echoed through centuries. Simone leaned back in her chair, her weathered hands now flat on the table. "You're describing the corruption of compassion, not compassion itself," she said quietly. "What you're calling emotion is really just preference, bias disguised as feeling. True compassion isn't about being moved by beauty or charm. It's about recognizing the fundamental dignity in every person, especially those who suffer." She paused, her gaze moving to the window, where rain still streaked the glass. "I worked in a factory once, before my academic career. 12-hour shifts, dangerous conditions, management that saw workers as expendable units in their rational calculations. The executives had charts, graphs, cost-benefit analyses that proved their system was efficient and logical. They felt nothing for the people whose bodies were breaking down on their assembly lines." Seneca nodded slowly, acknowledging the power of her example while formulating his response. "But surely you see the problem with your reasoning," he said, not unkindly. "Those executives weren't practicing true rationality. They were serving narrow self-interest. Real rational justice would consider the welfare of all stakeholders, not just profit margins. When I speak of reason-guiding justice, I mean the kind of thinking that transcends personal bias and immediate gain." "Transcends," Simone repeated, the word carrying a note of skepticism. "You speak as if we can float above human reality, make decisions from some pure realm of logic. But justice isn't administered by angels. It's carried out by people, in a world where children go hungry, while others debate optimal resource distribution in committee rooms." The conversation had found its rhythm now, each challenge met with thoughtful response, each response generating new questions. Neither was trying to win in any conventional sense. They were archaeologists of ideas, carefully excavating the foundations of their deepest beliefs. "Consider this," Seneca said, leaning forward slightly. "A city faces a crisis, limited medical supplies during an epidemic. Rational distribution based on factors like survival probability, age and social contribution might seem cold, but it saves the most lives. Compassion-based distribution, focusing on the most sympathetic cases, might save fewer people overall. Which approach serves justice better?" Simone's response came without hesitation, as if she had wrestled with exactly this scenario. "Your question assumes that reason and compassion lead to different choices. But what if the truly rational approach is the one that recognizes the immeasurable value of each human life? What if your utilitarian calculation is just another form of bias, the bias of those privileged enough to make such calculations from a position of safety?" The intensity between them was building, but it remained intellectual rather than personal. These were two people who had spent their lives thinking deeply about how humans should treat each other, and the stakes of their disagreement felt enormous. Seneca took a long sip of his wine, using the moment to process not just her words, but the passion behind them. This wasn't abstract philosophy to her. It was lived experience transmuted into principle. "You challenge my assumptions," he admitted, "but I challenge yours as well. How do we distinguish between authentic compassion and mere sentimentality? Between justice guided by genuine care for human welfare and justice hijacked by the loudest voices, the most compelling stories, the most photogenic victims?" The question settled between them like a gauntlet thrown down, waiting to see who would pick it up and what they would do with it. The tavern had grown quieter as the evening progressed, the early dinner crowd giving way to the more contemplative souls who sought refuge in dimly lit corners and slow conversations. Simone wrapped her hands around her coffee cup again, though the ceramic had long since grown cold. The gesture seemed less about warmth than about anchoring herself to something solid as she prepared to venture into more personal territory. "You want to know How I distinguish authentic compassion from sentimentality, she asked, her voice softer now, but no less intense. I learned it in Algeria, working with families whose sons had disappeared. The officials had procedures, protocols, rational frameworks for processing missing persons reports. Very logical, very efficient. She paused, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Seneca's shoulder, as if seeing into a different time and place. But when a mother came to the office, clutching a photograph of her 19-year-old boy, the officials would explain, quite reasonably, that without proper documentation, without following the correct channels, there was nothing to be done. They weren't cruel, they were rational. They were following the rules that kept the system functioning. Seneca remained silent, sensing that interruption would break something fragile in the moment. I sat with those mothers, Simone continued. I saw how the rational system, in its pursuit of order and efficiency, had become a machine that ground up human dignity, and I realized that true justice requires more than logical processes. It requires the capacity to see and respond to suffering, even when that suffering doesn't fit neatly into our categories. She finally looked directly at him again. Authentic compassion isn't about feelings or sentiment. It's about attention, the kind of focused, patient attention that allows us to see people as they actually are, not as our systems need them to be. Seneca absorbed this in silence, his fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the table. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality, less professorial, more personal. I understand your point, he said slowly. But I've seen the other side of that coin. I once served on a parole board, volunteer work, trying to apply philosophical principles to real decisions about real lives. We had a case, a young man, 22, convicted of armed robbery. No violence, first offense, genuinely remorseful. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The victim's family came to the hearing. The mother spoke about sleepless nights, about fear, about how this crime had shattered her sense of safety. She begged us not to release him. Her pain was real, her tears genuine. If we had followed pure compassion, response to visible suffering, we might have denied parole. Simone nodded, recognizing the complexity he was presenting. But the rational analysis told a different story, Seneca continued. Low recidivism risk, strong family support, job prospects, genuine rehabilitation. Logic said, release him. We did, and he's been successfully reintegrated for 5 years now. Sometimes rational justice requires us to act against immediate emotional impulses, not because we don't care about suffering, but because we care about preventing greater suffering down the line. But who made that rational analysis? Simone asked, her question sharp but not accusatory. Who decided which factors to weigh, which outcomes to prioritize? Your rationality didn't exist in a vacuum. It was shaped by assumptions, values, perspectives. The question isn't whether to use reason or compassion, but whose reason, whose version of justice gets to count as rational. The insight hit Seneca like a physical blow. He set down his wineglass harder than intended, the sound sharp in the quiet space between them. You're suggesting that what I call rational justice might simply be my own biases dressed up in logical clothing, he said, his voice betraying a hint of defensiveness before he caught himself and returned to his measured tone. I'm suggesting that pure rationality is a myth, Simone replied. Every logical framework rests on values, assumptions about what matters and what doesn't. The question is whether we acknowledge this openly and include the voices of those most affected by our decisions, or whether we pretend our reasoning exists above the messy realities of human experience. A long silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient sounds of the tavern, distant laughter, the clink of glasses, rain still pattering against windows. Both seemed to be processing not just the argument, but its implications for everything they had believed about justice, morality, and the foundations of ethical decision-making. Finally, Seneca spoke, his voice quieter than before. If you're right, if there's no neutral rationality, then how do we make any decisions at all? How do we distinguish between better and worse approaches to justice? Are we left with nothing but competing perspectives, each equally valid? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to fully confront. Simone's response came not immediately, but after a long moment during which she seemed to be weighing not just her words, but the entire framework of their discussion. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality, less argumentative, more exploratory. Maybe that's exactly where we need to start, she said, with the acknowledgement that there is no view from nowhere, No perfectly objective standpoint from which to judge. But that doesn't mean all perspectives are equally valid. It means we need to be much more careful about whose perspectives we privilege and why. She gestured toward the window, where the shapes of other buildings were barely visible through the rain and darkness. In that factory I mentioned, management had their rational calculations, but so did the workers. They understood the reality of production in ways the executives never could. Their bodies taught them about efficiency, safety, and human limits. But whose rationality got to shape company policy? Seneca found himself nodding despite his instinct to resist her conclusion. "You're arguing for a kind of democratic rationality," he said thoughtfully. "Justice that emerges from dialogue rather than being imposed from above. But doesn't that risk paralysis? Endless debate while people suffer?" "Sometimes," Simone admitted. "But consider the alternative. Swift, decisive action based on partial understanding. How many injustices have been committed by people who were certain they knew what was right? How many rational systems have perpetuated suffering because they never included the voices of those they claimed to serve?" The conversation had reached a point where both participants seemed to sense they were walking on newly formed ground, testing ideas that neither had fully articulated before. The tavern around them had grown even quieter, as if the building itself was leaning in to listen. "But this creates a paradox," Seneca said, his philosophical training asserting itself. "If we can't trust pure reason, and if compassion is unreliable, what do we trust? How do we build institutions, make laws, create systems that serve justice across different communities, different cultures, different experiences of what justice means?" Simone leaned forward, her eyes bright with the excitement of someone approaching a new understanding. What if that's the wrong question? What if instead of asking how to build the perfect system, we ask how to build systems that can change, that can listen, that can admit when they're wrong? She paused, collecting her thoughts. The mothers in Algeria didn't need perfect justice. They needed someone to acknowledge their suffering, to take their stories seriously, to admit that the existing system had failed them. They needed institutions humble enough to say, "We don't know everything," and courageous enough to try different approaches. Seneca was quiet for a long moment, his wine forgotten as he processed this shift in perspective. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "You're describing something that sounds almost spiritual, justice as a practice rather than a principle. But how do we prevent such a system from devolving into chaos? How do we maintain any standards at all if everything is subject to revision based on new perspectives?" "Through the hard work of constant attention," Simone replied without hesitation. "The same attention I was talking about earlier. Not the kind that jumps from crisis to crisis, but the patient, sustained attention that allows us to see patterns, to notice when our systems are causing harm, to recognize when our assumptions need updating." She picked up her cold coffee, made a face and set it down again with a small laugh that seemed to acknowledge the absurdity of their intense philosophical discussion in this ordinary neighborhood tavern. "Think about it," she continued. "Your judge with his unconscious bias. What if the system had built-in mechanisms to notice such patterns? What if decisions were reviewed not just for legal correctness, but for disparate impact? What if justice included the humility to say, 'We got this wrong,' and the flexibility to correct course?" The question seemed to open up new possibilities between them, a space where their different approaches might not be contradictory, but complementary. Neither rushed to fill the silence that followed, both sensing that something important was crystallizing in the space between their words. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, though neither of them noticed. The change in their dynamic was subtle but unmistakable. Where before they had been opponents testing each other's defenses, now they seemed more like collaborators, exploring shared territory from different angles. Seneca's rigid posture had relaxed slightly, and Simone's intense gaze had softened into something more contemplative. "You know," Seneca said, rotating his wineglass slowly between his palms, "I'm beginning to think we've been arguing about a false choice, as if justice must be either purely rational or purely compassionate, when perhaps the real challenge is integration." He looked up from his glass to meet her eyes directly. "Your factory workers possessed a kind of practical wisdom that the executives lacked. Knowledge born from experience, from having their bodies on the line. That's not anti-rational. It's a different kind of rationality, one that includes embodied knowledge alongside abstract principles." Simone nodded, but her expression suggested she was still working through the implications. "Yes, but integration isn't simple addition. You can't just combine detached analysis with empathetic response and call it balanced justice. The two approaches can transform each other, but only if we're willing to question our most basic assumptions about what counts as knowledge, what counts as evidence, what counts as rational. She paused, seeming to surprise herself with the direction of her thoughts. Maybe the real question isn't whether justice should be based on reason or compassion, but how we can develop forms of reasoning that are inherently compassionate, ways of thinking that don't treat human suffering as an externality to be managed, but as information essential to understanding the situation correctly. Seneca's eyes lit up with recognition. Like your attention practice, you're describing a kind of reasoning that begins with careful observation of actual human experience, rather than abstract principles imposed from outside. Exactly, Simone said, her voice gaining energy. But it's still rigorous reasoning. It still demands evidence, consistency, careful analysis. The difference is that it refuses to bracket out the human reality it claims to serve. The conversation had found a new rhythm now, less debate than collaborative exploration. Ideas were building on each other rather than colliding, creating something neither had anticipated when they first sat down. This changes how we think about institutions, Seneca mused. Instead of designing systems to minimize human error and bias, we might design them to maximize learning from human experience. Instead of seeing emotion as something to be controlled, we might see it as data about what's working and what isn't. Simone's response was immediate, as if she had been thinking along the same lines. And instead of seeing justice as a product to be delivered efficiently, we might see it as a relationship to be continuously renewed. Not, how do we get justice right once and for all, but how do we keep learning to do justice better? The bartender had begun the subtle end-of-evening rituals, wiping down surfaces, collecting empty glasses from abandoned tables, but their corner remained untouched, as if even the staff sensed that something significant was still unfolding. But this raises new questions, Seneca said, his scholarly instincts reasserting themselves. How do we institutionalize humility? How do we build systems that can admit error without losing credibility? How do we maintain enough stability to function while remaining open to constant revision? Simone considered this seriously. Maybe we start small. Maybe we experiment with processes that prioritize listening over deciding, that build in regular review and revision, that measure success not just by efficiency, but by the quality of attention paid to those most affected by decisions. She gestured toward the tavern around them. Like this conversation, we came in with fixed positions, but we created space for them to evolve. We listened not just to win arguments, but to understand something new. What if institutions could work more like this, less like machines applying predetermined rules, more like ongoing conversations committed to discovering better ways forward? The possibility hung between them, both exciting and daunting. Neither was naive about the challenges such an approach would face in a world that valued certainty over exploration, efficiency over depth, quick solutions over patient understanding. But something had shifted in their understanding, and there was no going back to the simpler world, where reason and compassion seemed like opposing forces rather than potential partners in the endless work of human justice. As the evening deepened around them, a new energy entered their conversation, not the sharp clash of opposing views, but the more complex dynamic of two minds recognizing both the promise and the peril of the ideas they were developing together. Seneca was the first to voice the concerns that had been building beneath their collaborative excitement. "I'm drawn to what we're exploring," he said carefully, "but I can't ignore the practical objections. This vision of justice as ongoing conversation, of institutions that prioritize listening and adaptation, it sounds beautiful in theory, but how does it work when facing urgent crises, when decisions must be made quickly with incomplete information?" He paused, his academic training wrestling with his growing sense that their discussion had opened up genuinely new possibilities. More troubling, how do we prevent such a system from being captured by the loudest voices, the most compelling narratives? If we abandon clear, rational standards in favor of ongoing dialogue, don't we risk justice becoming a popularity contest? Simone had been anticipating these objections, but that didn't make them easier to answer. She found herself staring at the patterns the rain had left on the window, as if they might contain clues to resolving the tension between ideals and implementation. "You're right to be worried," she admitted. "Any system can be corrupted, including the ones we're imagining. But consider what we're comparing it to. Systems that already systematically exclude certain voices, that already favor those with education, resources, and cultural capital to navigate bureaucratic mazes. She turned back to face him fully. Your concern about urgent decisions is important, but most injustice doesn't happen in crisis moments. It happens in the steady accumulation of small decisions, policies, and practices that gradually erode the dignity of people who lack power to challenge them. The emergency exception shouldn't become the permanent rule. Seneca nodded, acknowledging the point while still working through his concerns. But you haven't addressed the fundamental problem of relativism. If every perspective is equally valid, if truth is just what emerges from dialogue rather than what corresponds to reality, then how do we distinguish between justice and mere preference? How do we say that some outcomes are objectively better than others? The question struck at the heart of their emerging framework, and Simone felt its weight. This wasn't just philosophical nitpicking, it was a genuine challenge to the coherence of everything they had been building together. Maybe the problem is with the word equally, she said slowly, thinking through the issue as she spoke. Not all perspectives are equally valid, but all people affected by a decision deserve to have their perspectives taken seriously. The validity of a viewpoint isn't determined by abstract logic alone, but by its relationship to lived reality, by its consequences for human flourishing. She paused, recognizing that she was still working toward a full answer. Truth isn't just what emerges from dialogue, but dialogue is necessary for discovering truth, especially truth about justice, which is always about relationships between people, about how we live together. You can't understand those relationships from a purely external perspective. Seneca was quiet for several minutes, wrestling with ideas that challenged some of his deepest philosophical commitments. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of reluctant respect mixed with ongoing concern. You're asking me to accept that objectivity might be achieved through subjectivity, that we get closer to truth by including more perspectives rather than by transcending them. It's counterintuitive, but he paused, seeming to surprise himself. But my own experience in that parole board supports it. Our best decisions came when we managed to hold multiple viewpoints simultaneously: the victim's trauma, the offender's circumstances, the community's needs, the evidence about rehabilitation. Simone leaned forward, sensing an opening. Exactly. You weren't abandoning rational analysis. You were enriching it by refusing to ignore inconvenient realities. You were practicing a more complete form of reasoning, one that included emotional and social intelligence alongside logical analysis. But at some point, Seneca insisted, though with less conviction than before, someone still has to make a decision. Someone has to choose between competing claims, competing needs. How do we make those final choices without falling back on either arbitrary preference or authoritarian imposition? The question hung between them like a bridge they weren't sure they could cross, pointing toward territory that neither had fully mapped, but both sensed was crucial to understanding what justice might look like in a world that took both reason and compassion seriously. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving the windows of Molly's tavern streaked with water that caught and refracted the warm light from within. The evening crowd had thinned to just a few dedicated conversationalists, and the ambient noise had dropped to a gentle murmur that seemed to encourage the kind of deep reflection that had characterized the last phase of their discussion. Simone and Seneca sat in the aftermath of their intellectual journey, both sensing that they had traveled further than either had expected when they first began talking hours earlier. The question he had posed about how to make final choices between competing claims hung in the air between them, demanding not just an answer but a new way of thinking about answers themselves. Maybe, Simone said finally, her voice carrying the thoughtful quality of someone working through an idea in real time, the goal isn't to eliminate the difficulty of choosing, but to make our choices more worthy of the trust people place in them. She picked up her long cold coffee cup, more for the familiar gesture than for any hope of warmth. When we acknowledge that perfect objectivity is impossible, when we admit that our reasoning is always shaped by particular perspectives and values, we don't become less responsible for our decisions. We become more responsible. We can't hide behind claims of neutral expertise or pure logic. We have to own our choices and their consequences. Seneca found himself nodding slowly, following her logic even as it challenged his philosophical foundations. You're suggesting that humility about our limitations might actually lead to better decisions than false confidence in our objectivity. Yes, but more than that, Simone continued, her excitement building. When decision-makers acknowledge their limitations, they create space for feedback, for correction, for learning. Instead of defending decisions as rationally inevitable, they can ask, how did this work out? What did we miss? How can we do better next time? The insight seemed to unlock something in Seneca's thinking. Like the scientific method, he said, his academic background providing a helpful analogy. Scientists don't claim their theories are perfect or final. They test them against reality, revise them based on evidence, remain open to better explanations. But that doesn't make science arbitrary or relativistic. It makes it more reliable over time. Exactly, Simone said, leaning forward with renewed energy. Justice as an experimental practice rather than a fixed doctrine. We make our best judgment based on available evidence and ethical principles, but we also build in mechanisms to learn from outcomes, to hear from people affected by our decisions, to revise our approach when it's not working. They sat with this insight for a moment, both recognizing that they had found something like common ground, though not through compromise or splitting the difference between their original positions. Instead, they had discovered a framework that transformed their apparent disagreement into complementary perspectives on a shared commitment. This changes how we think about institutions, Seneca mused. Instead of designing them to apply unchanging rules efficiently, we might design them to facilitate ongoing learning about justice. Instead of training officials to implement policies correctly, we might train them to pay attention to results and adapt accordingly. Simone nodded enthusiastically. And instead of measuring success by consistency with precedent or adherence to procedure, we might measure it by actual outcomes for human flourishing, by the quality of relationships between institutions and communities, by the degree to which systems serve the dignity of all people involved. The conversation had found its natural conclusion, not through exhaustion or agreement on all points, but through the recognition that they had opened up new territory that would require much more exploration. Neither had converted the other to their original position, but both had been changed by the encounter. As they gathered their coats and prepared to return to the world outside, Seneca extended his hand to Simone, with a gesture that felt less like farewell than like the beginning of an ongoing collaboration. "I still believe in the importance of rational analysis," he said with a slight smile, "but I think I understand now that true rationality must include rather than exclude the full reality of human experience." Simone shook his hand warmly. "And I still believe in the necessity of compassionate attention to suffering," she replied. "But I see now that such attention must be disciplined by rigorous thinking if it's to serve justice rather than mere sentiment." They stepped out into the night air, cleaned fresh by the rain, carrying with them not answers so much as better questions, not certainty, but a shared commitment to the ongoing work of discovering what justice might mean in a world that takes both reason and compassion seriously. The tavern behind them returned to its quiet evening rhythm, but the conversation they had shared would continue long after they had gone their separate ways, in the decisions they would make, the institutions they would help shape, and the conversations they would have with others who shared their conviction that justice is too important to be left to either pure reason or pure sentiment alone. In the end, they had discovered that the question itself, should justice be based on reason or compassion, had been too small for the reality they were trying to understand. Justice, they had learned, requires both and more. The patient work of building institutions and practices worthy of human dignity, flexible enough to learn from their mistakes, and humble enough to keep asking whether they are serving the flourishing of all people, especially those whose voices are too often ignored in the grand conversations about how we should live together.